It seems maybe completely different, but it's really related. I'm really interested in looking at how people participate in their societies, and education is, oftentimes viewed as a mobilizing force to enable people to participate in society and to lead to more democracy. So that's kind of where this idea came from. There are some themes of what I look at in my dissertation here, but I also was really inspired by this recent article by Thomas Piketty, which I'll discuss. So here is higher education and civic participation in Brazil. The big question is, how does the expansion of tertiary education influence civic participation in Brazil? I think the assumption is that it would enhance civic participation. So there's a recent paper by Thomas Piketty, who's a French economist, does the expansion of education better explain widening gaps in political participation between the elite and the most marginalized, or does income and race?
Sure.
Yep.
You're calling like civic participation, political participation. What's civic participation?
Great. So civic participation is looking at participation in civic organizations, such as if you're a part of an environmental group, or even sports and recreation. What's very interesting about sports groups is there's this seminal paper in political science by Robert Putnam that shows that participation in sports and recreation organizations actually enhances civic participation more than any other group, because it's creating these vertical networks between people of different backgrounds. So yeah, I know, right? That's very surprising.
Mostly parents fighting with each other. That's what it really meant.
So then his follow-up book was, he basically compared civic participation and level of democracy in northern and southern Italy, and this is kind of what he found. In northern Italy, there was much more of a culture of civic association than in southern Italy. However, he also found that the effects of religious associations kind of decrease civic cooperation and levels of democracy. So this has been a book in political science that's inspired a lot of us, and something that really I've been thinking about since my second year here. And that leads me to a lot of these questions. So civic participation in any sort of association where you're interacting civically, whether it's charity or so on. Political participation, more so voting and political action. Thanks for that question. This is really relatively new stuff, so if I can have the patience of a first draft and your enthusiasm, as well as any sort of critical feedback or ways forward, that would be really great. So about 10 days ago, I came across this paper in the New York Times saying, why are democracies so bad at reducing inequality? Which is kind of a paradox, because we always think of democracy as leading to more equality. And so it cites a recent paper by Thomas Piketty, as I mentioned earlier, looking at the impact of higher education on civic and political participation, or rather just political participation in France, the UK, and the US. The paper is very nicely titled, "The Brahmin Left versus the Merchant Right." So the idea is that with the rise of tertiary education, there's also a rise of the intellectual elite into leftist parties. So Piketty shows this, I'll go back to this, over time. So this is in France and the US. The difference between percent of university graduates voting left and percentage of non-university graduates voting left increases over time. Basically, to go back into that, why are democracies so bad at reducing inequality? The common assumption has been the median voter model, whereas with rising inequality, there should be more pressure on the government for redistribution. That's what most people would think. Piketty is saying this is too simplistic. Politics is about ideas. What's kind of interesting about Piketty in general, as an economist, he said that in France, in order to have any sort of authority as an economist, you need to be a sociologist. So I think this is why he writes in this sense a little bit. So he decides to look at income versus wealth and education and voting patterns longitudinally, and he finds that higher education actually better explains voting patterns longitudinally in this shift. So basically, he's, yeah.
Give us a chance to look at that.
Absolutely. So with the rise of higher education in the US, France, and the UK, there's basically a movement of an intellectual elite that into leftist parties, or the intellectual elite is voting more leftist, as opposed to high income and high wealth elite in the right. So he thinks that this possibly could be contributing to rising populism. So basically, the social values of those participating and voting for leftist parties are changing over time as a result of higher
So
education.
they used to be working class parties,
Yes.
and now they're the parties of the elite.
Exactly. So he has only done this in 3 countries. Actually, Brazil is next up on the list for him to compare over time. So basically, he's just looking at voting records over time. So I think this is really interesting because that calls into question our previous assumptions about higher education, increasing civic participation and political participation, and leading to more equality over time. I think we can certainly see this in the U.S. I'd be really curious for people's opinions, in Brazil. He delves into the U.S. a little bit more by saying, particularly in the 1960s, it was really the intellectual elite supporting a lot of progressive social causes, and so that's how we can see these differences between the parties.
It was controlling for age, sex, income, wealth, and father's occupation.
Yeah.
But this figure doesn't imply like participation, right? It could imply like something like what Martin just said.
Yeah.
It's the working class that didn't have higher education, and now they are going to higher education, and now we are seeing like more people in college voting for. So
Yeah.
Well, he's controlling for age, sex, income, wealth, and father's occupation.
Right.
So, allegedly, and what you really want to do is to look within group, within age group,
Yeah.
I would say, because of what you're saying.
Yeah.
Because everybody's becoming more, I mean, the average education's rising, right?
Yeah.
yeah, I mean,
We also
my
don't
point
know
is
what-
this working class that's voting now would vote anyway. Like they would participate in elections anyway. You know what I mean? Like they didn't get higher education before, but they vote before. And now they get higher education, they continue to vote. It's not increase that participation.
Their kids continue.
But I mean, they would vote anyway. Like they are not increasing the participation, you know. They are just
No,
a special group.
No, he's just saying, here's the difference on the left. He's saying that the composition of the left has changed. The composition of the
Right,
left
but
has
that
changed.
can help because what you said. Imagine in 1950, few working class people, they would go to university,
Right,
but they participate in the election anyway.
right.
But now it's 1980. They go to university and they continue participating. It's not they increase their participation. It's not higher education.
They're kids now.
Yeah, with their kids, but their kids would participate anyway.
I think what he's trying to say is the composition of those participating in leftist parties has changed.
Yeah, except, but the other thing that's interesting is he doesn't tell us what percent of the vote is on the left.
Mm-hmm.
So the point is that we don't know whether this is a shift to the left while the left is increasing, or a shift of these people to the left while the left is decreasing. So it may be, I mean, it would help to know what the absolute left vote is. I think in the United States, you could argue, well, it's hard to say, constitutes, in the United States is very different from there's no real left party in the U.S.
Right.
And there were real left parties in France, so it's hard to,
Yeah.
there's real left parties in Brazil, and those,
For example, in Brazil, the working party, the PT, became very elite. A lot of the
well, if
university
you mean
people-
college, if you mean college educated, I wouldn't call that elite. Elite are people with, I mean, college educated could be, you know, workers, but new kinds of workers. I mean, the composition of the labor force also changed tremendously. The idea, I mean, in France, in the 1950s and in the US all the way until the early 1970s, there was a big industrial sector. You know, now you eliminate that industrial sector effectively in Europe. It's very small in Europe, and it's very small in the US. Yeah. And that whole core of left vote, I mean, there's something else going on here besides just people getting higher educated.
Yeah.
The nature
Of labor.
of work changes.
And the decline of labor unions, which, you know, used to
Absolutely.
galvanize
Yeah.
everyone to vote Democrat. There's no way, so I mean, I grew up in a working class family that's my dad was in a labor union, and there's just no way you would ever think of not voting Democrat.
Today, labor unions are basically government workers
Yeah.
in the United States. There's almost no industrial labor unions, no industry.
And if you think in light of of Trump's election, you could say that probably, you know, there is a core of those working class voters that their families would have always voted Democrat and so on, but they feel that their values are not necessarily being represented by the Democratic Party.
They become, I just think there's just a lot of stuff besides
Yeah.
average education rising,
Mm-hmm.
and it's going on here. But anyway.
Yeah,
onward.
I mean, this is exploratory because I read this and I had the same reaction. This was kind of surprising. Brahmin left versus merchant right. Leftist parties in France, the US, and UK were associated with lower educational attainment. Then gradually a multiple elite party system emerged. This is something to think about in terms of rising populism. Is it the people left behind? And moving forward, so as I mentioned earlier, Robert Putnam's book, basically he says that participating in associations, whether it's sports, recreation, arts, music, cultural, leads to more cooperation, particularly vertical cooperation, because it brings together people from different aspects of society. And then if there's more vertical cooperation, civic participation should be enhanced. So this is something I was thinking about in terms of reading Piketty's paper earlier. So Tocqueville is one of kind of the famous scholars of civil society, and one of the earliest. The art of associating together should grow in proportion with the participation of various social groups. So I think this is really interesting to look at in terms of Brazil. Because of the rise in the middle class and also the rise of education that we have seen in recent years. So if we're to take what Tocqueville assumes is that we should see an increase of middle class participation given the rise of middle class in Brazil. And also participation should increase with the expansion of education. So moving forward, Piketty feels that politics has never been a poor versus rich conflict. I was really intrigued by this, that, an economist is writing this. So he thinks that basically with globalization and educational expansion, this has led to new multidimensional conflicts about inequality and redistribution. Overall, I see this paradox in what I've been trying to discuss conceptually, and I'm still working through it. Educated individuals are more likely to participate in civic organizations, which is supposed to enhance cooperation and therefore democracy. There's a wealth of literature on the positive effects of education on individuals' political and civic participation. But at the same time, we can say, okay, so if there's this rise of professionals participating in civic associations, those with tertiary degrees are likely to have more authority over civic and political life. Perhaps they come into these organizations and they might dominate or have more active roles within them because they have more skills and more knowledge. And others might feel that they cannot participate to the same extent. I came across, so Peggy Fan was, I'm a fourth year student in international comparative education, and this was her dissertation in the same program. So she looks at education, civic, and political participation cross-nationally. So she's looked at some of these ideas I was hoping to explore in Brazil, but she does a cross-national longitudinal analysis using World Values Surveys data. So she challenges the assumption that an increased number of tertiary degree holders enhances civic and political participation at the societal level. Tertiary degree holders are basically more likely to participate in civic activities and more educated and more democratic, but what's surprising about her finding is that and also in less equal societies. So basically, tertiary degree holders are more likely to participate in civic activities in less equal societies. Expanded tertiary education increases the collective level of civic participation as expected, but not political activity. So basically, the tertiary degree holders in her longitudinal cross-national comparison, they are increasing in their political activity. So the expansion of tertiary education is not leading to a rise in collective political activity, like most of us would have probably assumed. And so here I started to think a little bit about Brazil and participation in civic associations. Why? Well, for my dissertation, I was looking a lot at basically civic participation in Brazil, and from what I've been reading about the protests, and I'd really be curious to hear it from everyone, is that the more recent protests have been more middle class, more professionals, and more elite, as opposed to in the past. So this is something that really interests me, and this is why I decided to look at these questions as opposed to earlier protests. So a friend of mine, Liz McKenna, she was a visiting scholar here, and she's a PhD student at Berkeley. She already did this, so I used it and gave her credit. So this is participation in civic associations in Brazil, again using the World Values data. And then we see different types of associations. Hopefully I'm not blocking everyone's views. There's definitely a story to tell about the religious organizations and that level of participation. There's not that many people really looking at this, which is definitely a question to look at. But we can really see over time the different levels of participation. One thing that's similar in her data and mine, because we're both using World Values Survey, is that you see this spike in participation in 2006. And what I hypothesize, based upon what I've read from studies using the Latino Barometer survey data, that's when there was much more support for democracy as well in Brazil at this time. So I'm curious if people have any thoughts on looking at this, or if anything comes as a surprise to people. So basically in 2006, there was probably a lot more fervor for participating in society than there is now. That's just one thing I could think of. Yeah?
So actually something I wanted to ask you was trying to get inside the head of a typical Bolsonaro voter,
Yeah.
for example. If you're seeing relatively educated and economically successful people joining the ranks or subscribing to a current of thought that is increasingly anti-democratic, how do you reconcile that with the FAM approach and some of the preceding analysis that you presented that would kind of twin the growth of democratic currents with civil society participation?
So overall, what I find in Brazil and what my results are is that there is expanded participation in civic organizations. However, when you look at the level of activity, So only 2 waves of the survey data measure the 2006 and 2014 measure active membership, whereas the 1991 wave only measures membership. When you look at active membership, higher education is particularly salient. So you have these tertiary degree holders moving into these associations or participating more, creating more networks between themselves, exchanging political ideas or opinions, and then they tend to have more leadership roles in these organizations. This ties in with some of my existing work on my dissertation, because what I find that across time, civic organizations with economic development and human capital become more professionalized. There's a seminal paper by my advisor, Woody Powell, looking at the rationalization of charity. So basically, organizations start to become more formalized over time and responding to these sort of pressures.
So put another way, how should we think about the case in Brazil of the growth of civic organizations that are either explicitly or implicitly anti-democratic?
I'm not saying that it's necessarily anti-democratic, but if we look at perhaps these are reinforcing the privileges of the elite is something we want to think about, right? You know? I haven't gotten there yet, and thanks for pushing me. I've only just kind of been exploring these data. Can we say that it's anti-democratic? Because if overall participation is increasing, that should be a good thing. But if we also see that elite active participation and elite participation is increasing, does that mean it's anti-democratic? There's kind of a tension here, right? I'm not sure how anyone else feels about this.
Well, religion and sports are anti-democratic organizations.
Yeah.
They're hierarchical, they're not democratic, and...
Well, what Putnam says is religion definitely is anti-democratic, and that's what he finds in northern Italy and southern Italy. But he actually finds the most support for the sports associations contributing to cooperation, because he writes a later book called, I think, Bowling Alone and the Decline of Bowling Leagues. And so he finds that the bowling league brings together different people more than like the arts association or the music.
But most of these sports
Yeah.
organizations are not bowling leagues.
Yeah.
I mean, most of the sports associations are hierarchical organizations organized to bring youth up to work with youth, and the parents are not the ones who are playing the sports.
Mm-hmm.
The parents are engaging their kids in the sports.
Yeah.
So there are sports leagues for adults.
Yeah.
And I think that in that sense, Putnam is right. Those are quite democratic, etc. But these other things are not democratic at all.
I agree, and that's why I'm hoping to go to Brazil and maybe unpack this a little bit, or hear from this audience about what these associations are like, because it's not a context I'm familiar with as well.
I think they have different shape
Yeah.
in a developing country than in a developed country. I mean, sports in the United States engages a huge number of people, organized leagues, etc. It's mostly for kids.
Yeah.
It was an extension of schooling, basically. It's much less democratic than schooling. I mean, in schooling, because people are paying taxes. I mean, you're voluntarily engaged in these sports. I mean, I've done this for many years, and they're very undemocratic.
And probably, I would imagine in a developing country, at least from
It's
what I've seen in
completely different.
Africa, usually when kids play sports, it's ad hoc. They're just getting together and throwing around a soccer ball.
What I think we're finding here is there is probably a paradox between democracy and participation.
Yeah.
And it depends what you participate in.
Exactly. So your point, I think, is very good, because participation doesn't necessarily mean more democracy.
Yeah.
People are participating more, but not necessarily
Act on their own.
acting more democratic. They are acting on their self-interest sometimes,
No, and-
right? So there's
and-
and particularly, I was thinking of your example, because your response was about the elites, and I think you were talking about economic elites, I would assume, and in the particular case of Bolsonaro, we're talking about like what we call minorities, right? You know, LGBT activists, and also issues of gender in Brazil are under attack by Bolsonaro's supporters. So participation in this particular instance doesn't mean more democracy.
And even, and I would say that when Putnam is writing about religion in Italy, and comparing the South and the North, he's talking about the Catholic Church. So the Catholic Church is a super hierarchical, undemocratic organization. But there are other religious organizations that are actually quite democratic. And would probably enhance democratic values. I've read about Unitarians, even Mormons. It's still hierarchy, but
Not the
it's
same.
also a lot of participation, involvement in community, etc. So Putnam's, I mean, it depends again on the religious organization, it depends on the sports. I mean, just to say this organization, just participating in an organization like this means democratic, non-democratic, I think is a very complex issue. You know, I mean, sports clubs in Brazil are businesses, basically.
Yeah, but you have to see what kind of sport. If you talk about football, I mean, you have a huge, amount of people doing this, playing without participating in anything. Just,
That's true, but the organized sport.
Oh yeah, the organized sport is what you said, but I think, the fact that you can play soccer all over the place in Brazil, I mean, it's very, very likely that the amount of people in this side, playing whatever, and
But
the organized one is very small.
Those kind of organizations are probably pretty democratic. But there's a whole other set of organizations in sports that are not democratic. So, again, it depends what you're participating in. Just to lump it all together.
Yeah, I think the other kind of sports is very organized by the elite. If you take soccer outside of sports, I mean, there's a lot of people, just playing outside these organizations. That's amazing. Another thing that I see that, for example, the charity one, the increasing, isn't that related to the fact that these non-government organizations before they were subsidized by some outside countries, and as this thing shifts to another country like Africa, the people in the country starts to be more organized in terms of charity.
Thank you. That's what I'm trying to say in my dissertation.
Say, what was it? I didn't.
That the shift in the charity organizations and the increased participation comes from, basically there were more international development agencies kind of doing that before. But then as Brazil developed, basically there's more local and national capacity to do aid work.
Where
Yeah.
this data is coming from?
It's World Value Survey again. This is, and that's also what I use.
Michelle, how about the impact of the social medias? Because today it's easier to get into civic association, right? In the past, people had to go outside of their homes.
That's an excellent point. And I think, I guess what I'm getting from this feedback is, do these civic associations reinforce elite privilege, or, are they contributing to democracy? And social media is an enabler too of that, and of creating these kind of echo chambers or networks. Yeah, I think his hand was up first. Yeah.
I'd be particularly interested about the role of health organizations over the last 3 years. And I guess it's probably something you're looking at with your dissertation. But I imagine that a lot of community health organizations have grown up to combat things like the spread of Zika and whatnot.
Yeah, that's what I'm looking at in my dissertation. World Value Survey does not address that. That's the challenge. It's really nice having survey data that's already been collected, but then you have the challenge of, you might not have the questions that you necessarily want in there. So how are you working with it? Yeah.
So just not to put too fine a point on it, but I think in the Brazilian context, there's a nuance that's really fascinating.
Great.
When we talk about consolidation of anti-democratic behavior or elite privilege,
Yeah.
there's two forms that or ways that it can manifest itself in civil society, either through the process of that organization or through the objective of that organization. So we talked a lot about process, right? In terms of the internal electoral mechanisms or modes by which people participate, which can reinforce elite privilege or somehow erode democracy. I also just want to underscore the degree to which orientation in an objective sense is something that also is a feature of Brazil today. So the rise of fringe groups on the right or fringe groups, frankly, on either side of the political spectrum, who are explicitly focused on the reining back in of Brazilian democracy and civic participation is just a phenomenon that I think is really interesting because it shows, hey, civil society is on the upswing, but at the same time, people who are taking advantage of those channels are doing so with the express purpose in mind of reining back in Brazilian democracy and civil liberties.
And there's a whole literature on that, looking at basically the Weimar Republic in Germany before World War II. People participated in civic organizations. There's a whole literature on kind of the dark side of civic associations, and maybe what we can say is too, elites have more resources to enable themselves to create these sort of groups, whether they have access to the internet or this sort of thing. Yeah, thanks. So I will move on. This is, so looking at all of the data I have from 1991 to 2014, type of association, hopefully it's not too small, art, music, and education, environment, labor union, other, political party, professional, religious, sports, and recreation. This is kind of looking at what a similar approach to what Piketty did, because my main challenge was I only have 3 time points. I was hoping to do a time series, but I could not with 3 because the World Value Survey, even though it's basically administered over many years for Brazil, there's only 3 time points. So I wanted to look at the participation difference between the most privileged and the most marginalized, and I look at race, income, and education. So with race, blacks versus whites; with income, top 10%, the top 10%, the bottom 10%, and with education, tertiary degree holders and those who have not completed primary school. So that's basically what I'm trying to do. I was really trying to be creative in how to work with this data because, as I said earlier, I only have 3 years when the survey was administered, and then the issue with looking at participation in these associations is for 1991 it's either member or non-member, and then for the other 2 years it's active member, inactive member, or not a member.
So this is the difference between the top 10% and the bottom 10%?
Yeah, I basically, I'll do it also by race, education, and income. I break that down in some of the next slides. Religious is kind of really interesting to look at here.
So this is the gap between
Yeah.
participation. So the gap is growing, you're saying, enormously?
Well,
in religious
particularly for
organizations,
religious organizations.
but also in environment,
Yeah,
labor unions?
the labor union
Because
also.
of the shift in the workforce, right?
Yeah, so I will move forward. And then we also see what's interesting is political party is slowly creeping upwards here. More towards it seems like there's more and more elite participation in political parties. So that's something I thought was interesting, and I think it kind of parallels current events in Brazil, particularly if we look at people engaging in protests.
Yeah, this data seems quite important for you. I would double check the sample strategy and also see if there is some difference across the years,
Yeah.
because these differences are not trivial, and there are other sources that you should compare, official Brazilian sources, to see if at least some dimensions this data really represents the reality of Brazil. For example, I know that the Brazilian Population Institute, they have some questions about religion association. So at least in these dimensions that we can observe in other official sources, I would compare to this survey.
Thank you so much,
Yeah.
and that's why I really was looking forward to speaking to everyone here.
Michelle, there's another problem.
Sure.
The bottom 10%, I just looked at the income distribution, so I did the wages, and I was stunned. 53% of the population
Is in the bottom.
2014 is below one minimum wage, okay? In income. And the top 10% start, I mean, to get top 10%, you have to go all the way down to about 4 minimum wages, meaning it's so skewed. I mean,
Yeah.
3% of the population, 3.5% of the population has 6 minimum wages or more, okay? So, versus 53% with less than 1 minimum wage.
Yeah.
So, it's, when you look at it that way, so if you're comparing the bottom 10%,
Yeah.
you're talking about people with a quarter of a minimum wage,
Yeah.
maybe less,
And more than half the
Versus-
population.
versus
Yeah.
4 minimum wages or more. I mean, you're talking about people living in abject poverty in rural areas versus people quite rich, upper middle class, in urban areas. I mean, you shouldn't do that.
Okay, I was following what Piketty did in the top
Yeah, no,
10
but
and the
it's
bottom
different-
10.
If it's
Yeah.
different doing this in the United States versus Brazil,
Yeah.
that's not.
So
my
that's,
thing.
yeah, I really like appreciate this feedback because I have this data
Even the
set.
bottom 10% in the US is way below the poverty line.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's not even working class. It's not even working class, it's people who are lumpen, I don't know what you call them, but they are not, it's taking a group that's truly totally marginalized. I don't think it's worth doing that. I mean, those people, how are they gonna participate in civic organization? They're basically able to live. They're surviving from minute to minute. So,
Yeah, so this
It's not a good
compares, it's like a
comparison.
difference in means.
what?
You don't have spare time to.
Yeah.
I mean, civic organization, what are they gonna do? Join their local, I don't know what.
This is, just to clarify, this is different in means in terms of their participation.
What?
This is difference in means in terms of
But
their,
it's between the top 10%
Yeah.
and the bottom 10%.
over time and how that's changed over time.
How do I read this graph? I'm honestly, I'm looking at the graph at the
Difference in
bar minutes,
participation.
but like what it means the top of, like what means the bar, you know, like, because the difference should be a point, right? The difference between one and other should be just a point, not a bar, right?
That's what you think?
I
Well, it's a
think so.
point, the difference should be a point, should be like, should be a line graph,
A line graph.
Yeah.
he's right.
No, it's just hard to read. I mean, I would like to know how to read this graph right
Sure.
now, like, because I can't.
So like, yeah, I see what you mean, one of those little things that has like the
Yeah.
point on the top and the box in the middle, and then the point on the
Yeah.
bottom. Yeah. I guess like the top is like kind of the mean of the elite, and then the bottom is the mean of the marginalized.
So, but the bottom is like a negative number. What that means?
That basically the level of participation has gone in the direction of the marginalized. So it's increasing in terms of the marginalized.
Okay, so.
Yeah. No, I really, this is so new, so I really
No,
need
no,
help
sure,
with this,
sure,
so
sure.
thanks.
Yeah,
Yeah,
just
because
try.
I was trying to figure that out myself too.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, I'm concerned about the reduction in the politicians. I mean, in 2014 is very small compared to the previous years.
Yeah.
I don't know about the other Brazilians, but I think now that politicians are getting together, no matter which party, no matter which social class. If they get to the power, they want to preserve it anyway.
Yeah.
And they are trying to make the law in a way that they never get to jail. They do corruption as a systematic approach. It's like gaining again, taking over the power. That's how I feel. But you don't see any more people fighting for combating corruption. There was a bid last year for combating corruption. They proposed by the Ministério Público. I don't know how to say.
Oh, you could say it in Portuguese. I understand.
Okay,
Yeah.
and then they made it completely the opposite, just to not have their colleagues or themselves into jail, and say 30% of the Congress is under investigation, and they still continue voting these types of laws. So it's like a gang trying to preserve their power, their incomes, and corruption in general. So maybe that's why it's so.
Yeah.
There's no big difference. They all vote. Their vote have the same power, so the engagement is very strong. This might be the reason why it has shrinked.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, thank you. No, that I took notes. Thanks. So again, with the graphs that Leo loves. No, thanks, because I was really trying to figure out data visualization can be tough. So
No, but yeah.
yeah, I see your point though. Yeah, so basically when the bar graph is going down, it means like more marginalized participation, and it's gone in that direction. And when it goes up, it's more elite participation. But I think I should do the box with the whiskers. That kind of makes more sense for my next one. And I just tried to keep them on the same line, which is like 0. So we have participation between privilege and difference between privilege and most marginalized. And then this is 1991 versus 2006, and then 2006 and 2014. So they're a little bit different. A few things just to sum up, because I know these are hard to read. As I said earlier, the difference in means in terms of education, tertiary educated versus those who have not finished primary school, income top 10% and lowest 10%. Race, so this race is something that Piketty's been called out on because he doesn't include race. And, you know, of course, in Brazil, it should be included. I also wanted to ask this group a question because with the race data, I had a little bit of trouble. In 1991, they have no category for black and white. They just have other. And in 2006 and 2014, they have black and white. So I don't know if I should include the black and white with black or not. I'm not sure how it would work. In the US, I think you could include it, but this, of course, varies according to context and if that made sense. So this is only black and white. So it does not whoever identified as black. In order to make that comparison. So as we said earlier, the religious group is interesting. What kind of surprised me with the participation in religious organizations is that it seemed to go down the most in terms of income. Yeah, if we're looking at 2014, a little bit less in terms of education, but then race, it looks like it actually favors more white participation over time, which kind of surprised me with the religious organization. So the privilege kind of goes the other way. So these are, I mean, this is kind of just descriptive at this point. I've run a few regressions as well. What's interesting in terms of the political party participation, if we're looking at 2006 versus 2014, is that we also see race being very, very salient with more white people participating in political parties. And that seems to be more important than income or education, at least according to these graphs. I'd like to maybe look at some of the preliminary regressions. I'm gonna talk a little bit because we don't have too much time, and I really want time for people's feedback. So basically, Peggy Fan in her dissertation found that political activism declines in a society that has more educated individuals. So this was very surprising for me, and something I think we want to think about as people who work on education, because we tend to think that it's going to increase participation. So is something happening where perhaps those who are more highly educated are kind of taking over the political activism realm, and others are not participating? So that's something she finds in her dissertation. Expanded tertiary education is associated with an increase in overall active participation in more democratic societies, and tertiary degree holders are more likely to be active. However, expanded tertiary education is associated with a reduction in overall political participation, especially in less equal societies. And those with tertiary degrees are more likely to participate in political activities than those without tertiary degrees. So then here are these graphs. As I said earlier, if I could have a little bit of help on the race question, I really like your point about redesigning this to like a box and whisker thing. Here we see, as I said earlier, we see a difference widening between the most educated and the least educated in terms of political party participation. There's an other type of organization category, so it would be great to find out what those sort of other organizations people are participating in. There's really a widening participation in labor unions in the direction of the highly educated, which surprised me. So perhaps for those who know Brazil well, are there unions among educated professionals? That's my guess. That's something that kind of surprised me looking at these graphs. Yeah. And then it seems like there's increasingly high income participation, particularly in professional associations in 2014, in art, music, and education, in environmental associations. Spike among whites in religious organization participation. I run a few preliminary regressions here. So we see higher education as being very significant in terms of participation in sports and recreation, professional, political, art, music, and education, labor. I'd be delighted to hear from my colleagues who are more quantitative than me on how I can do this better, because I'm sure I can. And this is basically on a binary outcome, whether they participate or don't. High income is highly significant in terms of professional organizations, somewhat significant in environmental, in art, music, and education. And we don't really see anything for white here. So I think.
What is constant?
It's the intercept of
Yeah,
the regression.
thank you. Yeah,
So-
it's the intercept of the regression. So I moved, yeah. The next regression I run is looking at active participation. So I know I'm throwing out a lot of terms. So this is binary, whether you participate or not, because the 1991.
Just member.
Yeah, because the 1991 wave only measured that, but the later two waves measured active participation. So we see a couple differences here in terms of active participation. It's as we anticipate based on the reading of Peggy Fan, in that higher education, individuals with higher education participate more. So we definitely see that here. And we see less of an influence of income and participation than we saw earlier. And also race we see.
You should probably
I really want to know how to make this better, so
we can interact
white
with higher
interaction
education,
variables.
with higher- White versus non-white,
Yeah.
right?
That's the challenge I was saying to the group earlier, is that the 1991 data does not have a category for specifically for different mixed races, whereas the later data does. So that's why I only did white versus non-white, and the problem is that, no, this is white versus black actually here.
So
This-
what happens to mestizo?
That's the challenge, is that in the 1991 data, they have a category for, I think they only have indigenous, they have Middle Eastern, but they don't have black and white, and they don't have black and indigenous or indigenous and white, whereas the later waves do. So this is kind of challenging for me in looking at this
Well,
question.
the interesting thing is it's negative
Yeah.
in most cases.
Yeah, I would also, I think it's quite important to check the weights of the sample. I don't know if you
Yeah.
do it or not.
Okay.
And that can make a lot of difference. The second thing is about regions. I'm not seeing like that we are controlling for different regions.
Okay.
Again,
I have that
you
data,
didn't-
so I can do it.
You didn't talk about the survey, so it's hard to know if they are going to every place in Brazil, every region.
They
in
are.
all the years, so that's quite important.
Okay.
And
I can definitely do regions. The survey is huge, so that's probably why I didn't walk through that as much, but I can definitely do regions.
yeah,
Yeah.
It is interesting, the education.
Yeah, I know this is
So, yeah, I think you have to control for region, because
Yeah.
who knows, all this, once you put region in, it may be that higher education coefficients go way down. 'Cause the
Gender could be
distribution of
interesting,
higher
too.
education is very unequal.
yeah. And also have like year fixed effects, because you have
Yes.
10 years.
I need to add year fixed effects, exactly. And one thing that was interesting to me was, in general, just looking at the data, kind of the spike in participation in associations and parties in 2006. As I said earlier, there's been a recent article by Latino Barometer saying that, support for democracy is on decline in Latin America, with that being the most apparent in Brazil. So I'm guessing, that could be part of it. I'm not really sure. I'm not sure if people have ideas about 2006. I mean, Lula was elected 3 years before. Maybe there was just a lot more enthusiasm.
Or it's just a simple problem.
Yeah.
I don't know, like if they collect in a different way,
Yeah.
if they ask different questions, I don't know if the questions are exactly the same. You even mentioned that about race, for example.
Yeah.
In one year they ask in one way,
Yeah.
in the other year they ask differently.
Yeah.
So,
Well,
I mean, I don't know if
2006 and 2014 are pretty much the same. It's just 1991 is different.
Sure.
So what's interesting is that there's
Yeah,
this spike
so-
in 2006 as opposed
Right,
to
but the
2014.
spike is compared to
Yeah.
1991. So if we had
Yeah.
like a survey, exactly survey in 2000,
Yeah.
maybe we will not observe that spike.
Yeah.
So that's my point about maybe look at a different source,
Yeah.
an official source, and this source maybe will not have like a lot of dimensions as you are analyzing, but at least the dimensions that you can compare, you could see, this survey here, it's useful because it represents pretty well what the other official source is
Okay.
saying.
Yeah,
So,
I'm definitely gonna hit you up on ideas, because I really I really welcome feedback on other sources I can look at, since I don't really know what data is available on Brazil in terms of this, so that's important for me. Here in general, when active participation is measured, I think we can see the influence of privilege more. These organizations are also likely becoming more formalized with time, with economic development and the expansion of human capital. And higher education seems to be highly significant for everything except religion, and which is not super surprising. High income is not significant at all when we just look at active participation. In racial privilege is a little more apparent when we look at active participation, except for in the case of labor and charity and humanitarian associations. So that will be something really interesting to explore in terms of the charity and humanitarian associations, I think. It looks like I might finish on time. So this ties in kind of with my dissertation. It's always important to, I have many interests in Africa and Latin America, so to have kind of a common theme that I work on is important. So basically, civic participation and the rise of the professionals. With economic development, civil society becomes more institutionalized. The state works more collectively with nonprofit organizations to deliver social services. So I think, and this is something I hope to write on eventually, is looking at, for instance, in Brazil, we can see with Bolsa Familia, civic organizations are becoming increasingly more specialized and sector specific and kind of moving away from their grassroots origins. So they're becoming more formalized, adopting strategic plans, metrics, and so on, and then hiring or involving professionals. So the rationalization of charity basically means increasing reliance on credentialed expertise. This occurs in organizations as they become more rationalized and they use more formal metrics and strategic planning. So as I said earlier, educated individuals are viewed as having more credentials and authority in organizations. The professionalization of organizations basically leads to the institutionalization of civil society. So these more professionalized, more specialized organizations are working more with the government to deliver social services. So an example I could say is like, an organization maybe, because I mean, most of my work has been in Africa. I did about 80 interviews last summer with local and national NGOs, and so I've seen very grassroots level organizations and then compared them in the capital. And what I see there is maybe in the rural areas, you see more organizations working with youth, like as an umbrella topic, and they work on many different things. They do human rights, they might do child malnutrition and so on. But then once you're in the capital, you start to see a couple of organizations that will work only on education, and they will have people that know the sector very, very well. So my hunch is that this is kind of what has occurred in Brazil over time. Perhaps at the time of democratization, there were many grassroots level organizations where, anyone could join up or be a part of, but now with the NGOization of civil society, we start to see these organizations becoming NGOs and becoming a lot more formalized. So this is kind of where I'm going with my dissertation and the work that I do. I think maybe we can see some echoes of this here, but it would be interesting to have feedback. So there's kind of a cautionary tale in all of this. So Maria de Gloria Gon, Avritzer, and Vodovic argue that the NGOization of civil society moves civic organizations away from social movement roots during democratization, and they start to become more formalized. So this increases local capacity to deliver services because these organizations they're more organized, they have evaluation plans, they have more professionals in them, whether they're voluntary or more formal nonprofit organizations. But this might actually reduce participation for marginalized communities. So I'm just really curious in your reflections or next steps. I've only been working on this for 2 weeks, but feel there's some potential here. There's some constraints in the data set. I was really excited to present to this group because you know Brazil much better than I do. And I know we have some people who are quite versed in econometrics as well. So I'd be eager to hear from you, and I can take criticism too. Thank you.